If you were being stalked by a machete-wielding maniac in the woods, what would you do? A crazy killer is creeping around Camp Crystal Lake, and it's not who you think. I'm here to break down the mistakes made, what you should do, and how to beat the Camp Crystal Lake killer in Friday the 13th. These unsuspecting teenagers are about to find out what happens when a scary campfire story turns into real life. In 1958, at Camp Crystal Lake, a group of campers were sitting around the fire singing and playing guitar. They had no idea the campground was being prowled by an unseen killer. Two of the counselors decided to sneak off and go make out, but just as they were really getting down to business, the killer caught them with their pants down and murdered them both. It's now Friday, June 13th, 1980, and new camp counselor Annie walks into a deserted-looking town on her way to Camp Crystal Lake. She stops in a general store, which seems like the only open place in town, and asks the people there for directions. When she mentions Camp Crystal Lake, everyone looks at her like she's crazy. They seem shocked that she even wants to go there, but an old guy named Enos agrees to take her halfway in his truck, since he's traveling in that direction. On their way to the truck, another crazy old townie named Ralph asks her if she's going to Camp Blood. He tells her that the place has a death curse and that she'll never come back from there again. Annie and Enos ignore him for now, but they have no idea what's waiting for her in the woods. Driving further into the countryside, Enos asks Annie if she knows what really happened at Camp Crystal Lake. Annie says that her boss hasn't told her anything, and that's when Enos tells her that he thinks the camp is cursed. He tells Annie about the two counselors who were murdered in 1958 and a boy who drowned there in 1957. There's also been unexplained fires and polluted water that have made the camp notoriously impossible to keep open. Despite all these warnings, Annie says she can't just quit her job. She says that she isn't afraid of ghost stories, but soon she's going to find out that ghosts aren't the only thing to be afraid of. Soon it's time for Annie and Enos to go their separate ways as he drops her off at the entrance to the graveyard. Meanwhile, at the camp, three new counselors, Jack, Ned, and Marcy, arrive together and meet the owner, Steve, and another counselor named Alice. He quickly assigns them all chores, and they get to work fixing up the cabins. Walking down the road, Annie hitches a ride from another stranger. Things seem normal at first, even though the driver isn't very talkative, but suddenly they speed right past the entrance to the camp. Annie suddenly panics and leaps out of the speeding vehicle into a ditch on the side of the road, injuring her leg in the fall. She tries to run into the woods, but the stranger parks their car and follows her. Annie can't get far on her hurt leg, and just when she thinks she might have escaped, the killer pops right out in front of her and slashes her throat with a huge hunting knife. The killer of Camp Crystal Lake has officially claimed their first victim of the summer. That makes one camper down, with 7 more to go. Okay, this is one camping trip I think I'd already rather sit out. Annie here didn't even make it to her cabin, and it's still broad daylight. It doesn't take great detective skills to see that something is off about Camp Crystal Lake. At this point, it should be common knowledge that if you stop in a half-deserted town to ask for directions, and the local crazy guy tells you not to go, you listen to him. Especially if more than one of the townsfolk refer to the place you're going to as Camp Blood, I'd say it's time to look for a new summer job. Take it from me. Minimum wage pay and awkward hookups are definitely not going to be worth getting mutilated over. Annie should have known just from the locals' reactions that Camp Crystal Lake was the last place she wanted to go. To make things worse, Annie has decided to catch rides with total strangers and hitchhike her way to the cursed campground. Many areas discourage or have totally banned hitchhiking because of the potential dangers for both the driver and passenger. There really is no way of knowing who you're getting in the car with, and it's much safer to use public transportation or get a ride from someone you trust. Since there are no buses to the camp, Annie should have just tried to convince Enos to drive her the rest of the way, or ask her boss for help getting there. But apparently, having never heard of stranger danger, Annie is happy to jump in the car with the first person who comes along. Little does she know that this ride is going to be her last. When the car speeds right past the entrance to the camp, Annie knows that she is being kidnapped. Now, this is an absolutely terrible terrifying scenario, but there are actually several things you can do to escape, and you'll need to act quickly if you want to survive. First of all, if you're traveling alone, it's important to let multiple people know where you're going and when you're expected to arrive there. That way, if anything goes wrong, they will be able to contact help right away. I would have asked the owner of the local deli to call my boss at Camp Crystal Lake and tell them I was close by, and contact the police if I'm not there by nightfall. Now, if somebody tries to kidnap you in a place where there are other people around, the most important thing you can do is scream and fight back like crazy. This will slow your kidnapper down and call as much attention to you as possible, hopefully causing other people to notice what's going on. But Annie is getting in the car with total strangers in the absolute middle of nowhere, so the situation is going to be a little different. In this case, experts say that you should calmly evaluate the circumstances and try to come up with a plan for escape. Sometimes the best thing to do is just wait and see what your kidnapper has planned and hope for the best. Annie may be in the middle of the woods and quickly driving away from the camp, but all roads lead to some sort of civilization, and if she had waited a little longer, they might have seen a gas station or another car, giving her a chance to jump out where somebody can help her. They might have even seen a police officer, which would have been really lucky. If I wasn't in any immediate danger, I would have just waited for the first sign of other people and then jumped out of the car screaming like an absolute maniac so that everyone around would come see what's up. Eventually, you may have to fight back against your kidnapper, and the best time to do that is while they're driving. You can pull the keys out and shut off the engine, grab the steering wheel and cause the car to crash, or even brace yourself against the door and deliver a flurry of karate kicks to your kidnapper's face. I would have waited for the car to slow down, going around a turn, and then attacked the kidnapper and grabbed the wheel to hopefully crash the car into a ditch. If I was really lucky, the kidnapper might even be knocked out in the crash. Then I could exit the car safely and run for help as fast as I could. Annie decides to dive out of the vehicle directly in a rocky ditch while traveling at high speeds, which is actually the exact opposite of what you should do here. It's remarkable that she was even able to get up and hobble away from that on her busted leg, and not surprising that the killer was able to catch up to her so easily. If your kidnapper parks their car and chases you into the woods, it's safe to assume two things. They probably have a weapon and they probably want to kill you, and that's going to be a battle of life or death. I would have tried to trick the kidnapper into thinking I ran one way and then snuck up behind them and went full Rambo mode. One good hit with a rock to the back of the head would hopefully turn the tables and give me the upper hand in the fight. After that, I'd grab the car keys out of their pocket and just head home. I honestly feel bad for Annie here. She was really looking forward to her first year as a camp cook, but it looks like her career was tragically cut short. Meanwhile, back at camp, the rest of the counselors are going off and swimming in the lake. They have no idea about Annie's violent murder that just happened only a short distance away. Even worse, the killer is still out there and stalking them from the woods. Marcy and Brenda almost notice that they're being watched, but Ned pops up from underwater and distracts them, giving the killer time to hide. As they're about to get back to work, Ned starts flopping around like he's drowning, but it turns out he was just trying to trick one of the girls into giving him mouth-to-mouth. Later that day, Alice is getting changed in her cabin when she notices a big snake slithering across the floor. She screams out for Bill, who comes running in and is quickly followed by the rest of the group. They all gather around, staring at the snake under the bed, until Jack knocks over a nightstand, sending everyone into a panic. They destroy half the cabin before Bill finally chops the snake's head off with his machete. A police officer on a motorcycle pulls into camp and starts questioning them. He says that he's looking for Ralph, the local crazy guy Annie met before. The counselors say they haven't seen him, and even though the officer is still suspicious of everything going on at the camp, he gets a call from his chief and has to head back to the police station before he can ask any more questions. Alice is getting things ready for dinner, and when she opens up the pantry, she is jump scared by none other than Crazy Ralph, who was hiding there the whole time. Ralph says he was sent there by God to warn them of the camp's death curse, and that they're all doomed if they don't leave now, before awkwardly riding off on his bike. Later on, when they're finishing dinner, Alice notices that the power is out, so Jack, Bill, and Brenda go to start up the emergency generator. Ned sees Jack and Marcy making out by the lake and gets jealous. He decides to go find something else to do, and that's when he sees a mysterious figure watching him from a cabin. Ned calls out to get their attention, but the person silently walks out of sight, and Ned follows them to investigate. Soon a thunderstorm rolls in, and Jack and Marcy take shelter in the cabin. The place is pitch dark, and nobody else seems to be in there, so they light some candles and go back to making out. They're so busy that they don't even realize the killer is watching them through the window. And that's not even the worst part, because they have no idea that in the bed right above them is Ned with his throat slashed, just like Annie. That makes 2 campers down, with 6 more to go. Okay, these counselors are clearly underqualified for the job. It's their first afternoon at the camp and they're already goofing off instead of working on the cabins. Since they can't even pay attention to their boss's simple instructions, it's not surprising that they don't see the killer watching them from the woods, even though it's daytime and they're only about 40 yards away. Ned might think he's a real stand-up comic, but playing practical jokes like he does here can actually have serious consequences. Everyone knows the story of the boy who cried wolf, and the lesson we're supposed to take away from that is to never joke about something serious as life or death, because no one will believe you when you really need it. Ned pretends to be drowning to get a kiss, which is less funny and more creepy if you ask me, and I definitely wouldn't be in a rush to save him next time. Goofing around like this is very inappropriate behavior for a camp counselor who is going to be trusted with the safety of children. Even if there isn't a crazy killer out for revenge, counselors whose negligence results in harm to one of their campers often face severe legal punishment. Basically, Ned and the rest of them better start taking this job more seriously and fast. Another example of how unqualified they are is their reaction to the snake in Alice's cabin. While this snake definitely seems scary at first, the truth is that it's probably harmless. In general, most wild animals are more scared of us than we are of them, and will never attack a human unless provoked. Most species of snakes, including those native to the area around Camp Crystal Lake, pose no danger to humans, and it's important to know the difference, especially if you're a summer camp counselor. They could have identified this snake based on its black top and white belly. Plus, it's a large size, and its behavior of hiding inside a cabin, as likely being a rat snake, a species that is completely harmless to humans. A late afternoon visit from a police officer looking for a crazy guy should have set off some red flags for these delinquents. They may not have seen anything suspicious yet, but a warning like that from a cop is definitely something to take seriously. I would have split everyone up into groups of 2 or 3 and checked every cabin on the campground. Even if I didn't find Crazy Ralph hiding inside, I would have made sure to lock all of the windows and doors to each building so that nobody could get in. Then, I would have gathered everyone together to spend the night in just one cabin. This may seem like overkill at the time, but there is safety in numbers, and I'd rather have as many people around as possible if a crazy guy was trying to break into the cabin in the middle of the night. Now, when the crazy guy actually popped out of my damn pantry, I would be going full code red. That's even before he started spouting off about a death curse. Ralph is the textbook definition of a harbinger, a stereotypical character who tries to warn future victims of their impending doom. Annie might have failed to listen to him the first time, but there's no chance that I'd be making that mistake again. After a visit from a harbinger, it's time to stop whatever you were thinking about doing and try to bail yourself out of the situation immediately. Forget locking doors and windows. It's time to get in the truck and leave if you can. Also, I would have called my boss right away and told him what just happened. Death curses and a crazy bum roaming around the campground are honestly way above my pay grade, and I probably wouldn't have taken the job if any of this was mentioned during the interview. I would want someone who gets paid to deal with this, preferably somebody with a gun to show up right away. Either my manager could figure out how to make sure I was safe, or I would get the cops involved, which they should have done anyway since an officer was literally just there looking for Crazy Ralph. I know they're lazy, but is it really that hard to think to call the police and say, hey, the guy you're looking for was just in my pantry practicing his doom prophecy? These kids are really as dumb as they come, and soon not taking things seriously is going to cost them big time. The bottom line is that it's definitely not a good time to sneak off to go make out, like Jack or Marcy, or to creep on your fellow campers from a distance like Ned. There are thousands of people who have gone missing in the wilderness and state parks with no logical explanation. So, when Ned is walking alone and sees a strange figure silently disappear inside a cabin, it probably isn't the smartest idea to follow them in, no matter how thirsty he is for a woman's touch. If it were me, I would have run back to the rest of the group at the first sight of someone watching me. Since I know Jack and Marcy are together, if everyone else in the group is accounted for, then it would be clear right away that we are being stalked by an unknown person. When Jack and Marcy sneak into the pitch dark cabin, they don't even look around to see if anyone else is there. Seriously? I would have checked in every corner and under every bed before I got comfortable in there. This is a dark cabin in the middle of the woods in a horrific thunderstorm we're talking about, and these two two don't even take a second to check their surroundings before they start making out. They're too preoccupied to even notice Ned's dead body in the bed right above them. Ned's jokes never really landed with the ladies, and it looks like this time the killer got the last laugh. Never suspecting the danger they're in, Marcy goes to use the bathroom, leaving Jack alone in bed. He's zoning out and smoking a joint when a drop of Ned's blood falls onto his forehead from the bed above him. The killer suddenly reaches out from under the bed, holding Jack down and piercing right through his throat with an arrow from below. Jack gasps for air as a huge spurt of blood comes gushing out of his neck. He's totally dead, and that makes 3 campers down, with 5 more to go. Marcy runs through the thunderstorm half naked and makes it inside the bathroom building. She goes into the stall to use the toilet and has no idea that the killer is following right behind her. The killer creeps in through the bathroom looking under all the doors and quickly sees Marcy's feet and flashlight. Marcy hears a noise, and at first she thinks it's Jack, but when she doesn't find him there, she figures that it must be nothing. While she's washing up in the sink, she hears another creepy sound, and thinking it must be her friends playing a prank on her, she decides to really investigate this time. She flings open the curtains to all of the showers, expecting to find whoever is in there, but she still doesn't see anyone. And that's when the killer sneaks up behind her with an axe. At the last second, Marcy turns around and screams, and the killer decides it's time to bury the hatchet right in her forehead. That makes 4 campers down, with 4 more to go. Okay, now these kids are dropping like flies, and if they don't get things under control soon, they'll all be done for. Jack and Marcy were eager to find somewhere they could be alone, but this just gave the killer a perfect opportunity to catch them both by surprise. The #1 rule of the United States Forest Service Guide for Outdoor Safety is to always travel with a companion in case of any emergencies. In remote areas like Camp Crystal Lake, you should stick to groups of at least 4 people. That way, if someone is hurt, one person can stay with him while the other 2 go for help. All the killer had to do was wait for the 2 of them to split up, and as soon as Jack was alone, the killer took that exact moment to strike. I would have gone back to the cabin with everyone else, because it just isn't safe to be out there alone in the middle of the night, even when there isn't a maniac out to get you. Not only is Marcy going to the bathroom alone, but she is doing so barely dressed in the middle of a massive thunderstorm. She's breaking 2 or more important rules from the U.S. Forest Service's safety guide: to always wear appropriate clothing and equipment, and to be aware of bad weather conditions. I understand that she was only planning to be gone for a minute, but in the wild, you need to always be prepared for emergencies. If the killer comes for Marcy now, even if she manages to get away, she doesn't have the right gear to survive a night or 2 alone in the woods. In her underwear and just a light raincoat, she'll be soaking wet and freezing cold in a matter of hours, and quickly be on her way to dying from exposure. She's also not carrying a compass, map, or any other navigational equipment, so if she winds up too far from camp and the road, she'll probably be totally lost. If I was spending the night in the woods in a large thunderstorm, I would be kitted out like Bear Grylls everywhere I went, even if it was just a quick trip to the outhouse. I would at least have on appropriate clothing for the weather and a few emergency items in my pockets. That way, if I needed to make a quick escape, I would stand a chance of surviving out in the wild. Now, let's try a quick test. You're a defenseless teenage girl alone in a creepy outhouse you thought was empty, and you heard several strange noises from somewhere in the darkness. Do you A, go towards the noises to investigate, or B, get the hell out of there as fast as you can? If you answered A, congratulations, you're dead. If it were me, I would have been sprinting back to the cabin like Usain Bolt at the first creak of a floorboard. It could be an axe murderer, could be a raccoon, but one thing's for sure, I wouldn't be sticking around to find out. But you know what they say, curiosity killed the cat, or in this case, killed the Marcy, and they're probably going to need some new shower curtains for opening day. Instead of practicing her acting in the mirror, Marcy should have practiced her 100-yard dash, because the killer is the one with the real chops around here. Meanwhile, Alice, Bill, and Brenda are playing a game of strip Monopoly in their cabin when suddenly they're interrupted by the heavy storm outside flinging open the door. This reminds Brenda that she might have left the windows in her cabin open, so she decides to run home alone and shut them before all of her stuff is completely soaked. As she's getting ready for bed, Brenda goes to wash up in the same bathroom where Marcy was just killed. She starts brushing her teeth and has no idea that the killer is there watching her from inside one of the showers. Brenda hears a few too many strange noises and starts to get a little creeped out, so she decides to head back to her cabin with the killer following close behind. Just as she's sitting down in bed, Brenda hears a young boy calling out for help somewhere in the darkness. She grabs her flashlight and walks out into the rain, following the sounds of his cries for help. She stumbles around in the dark with no idea where she's going until suddenly bright lights flash on all around her, and she realizes she's in the middle of the archery range. Brenda looks around in a panic as she tries to figure out what's going on. The next thing Alice and Bill hear is her screaming as the killer claims yet another victim. That makes 5 campers down with 3 more to go. Bill comes back from checking on the generator, and Alice tells him that she's worried because she thinks she heard Brenda screaming, and for some reason the lights are on at the archery range. Bill decides to go check things out, and Alice goes with him. They get to Brenda's cabin, but they don't find her inside. What they do find horrifies them both: a bloody axe laying on Brenda's bed. They head to Jack and Marcy's cabin next, but they don't find anyone there. Finally, they decide to check the bathroom, and Alice is really starting to get creeped out. She says that she thinks they should call someone for help. Bill and Alice head to the main office to use the phone, but the door is locked, and Alice has to break the window with a board she found nearby. They make it inside, but the phone is dead, so they won't be able to use it to call anybody. They try to start up the camp truck, but it won't turn over, and with no way to fix it, they decide to stay and wait for Steve to come back. Steve is on his way back to camp to check on them because of the extreme weather, but on the way his truck gets stuck, and he has to hitch a ride from a police officer. The officer mentions that it's been a crazy night, and he thinks it has to do with the full moon. They almost make it to camp when the officer gets a call that he is needed immediately at a bad accident, and so he has to drop Steve off to walk the rest of the way. Steve finally makes it to camp, and just as he does, he is blinded by a bright flashlight from behind the sign. He recognizes the person holding the flashlight, but has no idea if they're actually the killer, and suddenly he ends up the next victim before he can even get a chance to help anyone out. That makes 6 campers down, with 2 more to go. Okay, somehow things just keep getting worse for these campers. Brenda goes back to her cabin alone, half-dressed, which we already know is a terrible idea, but at least when she hears creepy noises in the outhouse, she decides to leave. If she could have just stayed away from investigating any creepy noises, she might have actually made it out alive. But when she hears what sounds like a little boy calling out for help in the storm, her curiosity gets the best of her. Now, Camp Crystal Lake is miles from any civilization. It's the middle of the night, pouring rain, and there were no other groups of people out there during the day. Basically, Brenda should know right away that there is no little boy calling for help, and that it's most likely a trap. I would have been reminded of stories I've heard of a creature called the Wendigo, an evil forest spirit which eats humans and can mimic calls for help to attract its victims. Even though Wendigos probably aren't real, just the thought of it alone would have been enough to keep me locked up in that cabin with the lights on all night long. Brenda is either too brave or too dumb for her own good, and pays the price for deciding to investigate. She might not have been the first pick, but the killer finally decided to give Brenda her moment in the spotlight. Bill and Alice finally start making good decisions when they go together to check things out. Finding a bloody axe and no trace of your friends is not a good sign, and Alice is right when she says they need to call for help. I would have headed straight down to the main office and tried to call someone using the phone. If the phones were dead, like they are for Bill and Alice, I would have also tried to get the truck started and drive into town. Since neither of these plans work, the 2 of them decide to stay put and wait for Steve to arrive in the morning, which is actually another very good idea. The Forest Service Guide says that the most important thing to do if you have an emergency in the woods is stay where you are and wait for help, especially if it's nighttime and you're in an unfamiliar area. Unfortunately, they don't realize that Steve is never going to make it back to camp. Steve is worried about the bad weather and decides to head to camp to check on everyone. He should have checked the weather earlier in the day and spent the night at the camp if he knew the storm was going to get dangerous and the roads would be difficult to drive on. When he finally does make it to camp, he runs into a person he knows, but who definitely doesn't belong out there, waiting for him at the entrance. I would have been suspicious right away, since the person has no business being out in the middle of the night during a huge storm, and especially because of the history these 2 have, which we find out about later. I would have backed up and asked them what they were doing there instead of getting within stabbing range like Steve decides to do. Sure enough, Steve is killed too, and the future for his camp isn't looking very bright. Back at the camp, the killer sneaks into the generator room and turns off the power and all of the lights. Bill lights some lamps and then tells Alice he's going to go check on the generator and that she should stay behind and get some sleep. He makes it to the generator room but can't figure out why it won't start and decides to have a look around. Suddenly, Alice wakes up on the couch screaming out for Bill. She thinks about it for a minute and remembers that he left to fix the generator. She starts the gas stove stove with a match and makes herself a pot of coffee, adding extra sugar from the pantry to try and keep herself awake. After a few minutes, Alice gets too anxious and decides to go looking for Bill. Alice heads to the generator room and at first can't find any trace of Bill other than his red raincoat lying in a heap on the floor. She calls out to him a few more times, and just as she's leaving and closing the door behind her, she finds Bill's body pinned to the other side with arrows all through his chest and face. Now she definitely knows there is a murderer out to get her, and that makes 7 campers down with 1 more to go. Alice runs screaming back to her cabin in an absolute panic. She slams the door shut behind her and tries to keep it closed by tying a rope to the handle and attaching it to the ceiling. She locks all of the windows and closes the blinds so that the killer won't be able to see in. Then she grabs more furniture and random heavy objects and stacks them against the door. Even with all of this prepared, Alice is still totally freaking out, and she grabs a baseball bat and a big fork from the kitchen to try and defend herself. Just as she is wondering how possibly to get out of this situation alive, Brenda's dead body comes crashing through the window, bloody and tied up with a rope. Alice is having a full-blown mental breakdown when suddenly a car pulls up outside. Alice runs outside thinking it's Steve, but is surprised to see that it's actually a harmless-looking old lady out here in the middle of the night. The old woman introduces herself as Mrs. VOORHEES'S and says that she's an old friend of Steve's. Alice runs to her begging for help, hardly able to babble out a complete sentence. Despite Alice's absolute panic and insistence that there is a killer on the loose, Mrs. VOORHEES doesn't seem the least bit concerned. Mrs. VOORHEES enters the cabin and sees Brenda's dead body, but her reaction seems totally off. She tells Alice that Steve should have never tried to open this place, and suddenly she launches into a psychotic rant and reveals what's actually been going on. Mrs. VOORHEES says that she was working as the cook at the camp in 1957 when her son Jason drowned in the lake because the counselors weren't paying attention. She says that they should go, but Alice is totally freaked out and wants to wait for Steve instead. Mrs. VOORHEES tells her that Steve won't be coming because she killed him so that he couldn't open up the camp again. Just then, Mrs. VOORHEES spirals into a full-blown psychotic episode and starts chasing Alice around the cabin with a knife. Alice grabs a poker from the fireplace and strikes her with it, knocking her down onto the couch. She uses this moment to escape out of the cabin, but Mrs. VOORHEES quickly recovers and is back in pursuit. Alice runs to the car, but when she opens the door, she finds Annie's dead body sitting in the passenger seat. She screams and runs away right into Steve's dead body, which is hanging from a tree. Mrs. VOORHEES is now close behind her, speaking in the voice of her dead son, and Alice takes off into the forest. Okay, now Alice knows what she's up against, and it's time to put this old lady turned serial killer into permanent retirement. Bill and Alex deciding to split up at this point is almost unfathomably dumb, especially after they found a bloody axe in their friend's bed. By now, they should know that the safest thing is to stick together. Alice smartens up and decides to go looking for Bill, and she also makes a pot of coffee which should keep her awake and help her react more quickly to any danger. She finally does find Bill at the generator room, but the several arrows sticking out of his body make it clear that there is a killer on the loose and only one target left. Bill tried his best, but his plan for survival turned out to be all full of holes. Just like Alice, I would have ran straight back into the cabin and prepared myself for a home defense scenario. Experts say that during a home invasion, the most important thing to do is to contact the police, stay quiet, and prepare to defend yourself. Since the phone lines aren't working, Alice is going to have to handle this on her own. The rope tied around the doorknob is a great idea, and I would have kept stacking any heavy furniture I could find in front of the door and windows. I would have also grabbed the baseball bat to defend myself, although the fork seems pretty useless. Then I would have turned off all the lights, found a spot to hide, and came out swinging like Barry Bonds at the first sight of trouble. When the car pulled up out front, I would have at least waited a minute to see who it was before I took down all the barricades I just put up, especially since my friend's dead body was just flung through the kitchen window a moment before. After finding out that the killer was Mrs. VOORHEES all along, I would actually be pretty relieved. Now that I know I was only up against someone's crazy grandma, I'd feel more confident in my ability to get out alive. We all know that it's never okay to hit an old lady, but after she's violently murdered 7 of your friends, it's time for the gloves to come off. She may be possessed by the vengeful spirit of her dead son, but there's still no way she could take me in a fair fight. I would have knocked that old geezer right to the floor and tied her up with the rope I was using to hold the door shut. Then I would have grabbed the keys, stole her car, and drove off, even if Annie's dead body body was in the passenger seat. Alice is going to need to get herself under control and take the fight to Mrs. Voorhees if she wants to stay alive. Alice makes it to the generator room and finds an old shotgun, but she can't find any shells. While she's fumbling around in the dark, Mrs. Voorhees sneaks in behind her and turns all the lights on. Alice points the gun at her, pretending it's loaded, but Mrs. Voorhees slowly walks towards her, totally unfazed. Since she has no bullets, Alice can't shoot her and just throws the whole gun at Mrs. Voorhees, trying to slow her down. She backs up, throwing any random object she can find, but Mrs. Voorhees keeps coming. She pins Alice against the wall and starts slapping the absolute crap out of her, seeming like she is really enjoying it. She throws Alice through a table, but Alice is able to roll over and get the gun again and uses it to bash Mrs. Voorhees right in the crotch, and then straight across her face, knocking her unconscious. Alice is able to escape again, but Mrs. Voorhees wakes up quickly and gets right back to chasing her. Alice hides in the darkness and lets Mrs. Voorhees run by before doubling back to the cabin. She heads back inside and turns off the lights, hiding in the pantry where Crazy Ralph was before. She waits for a while until she hears a crashing sound from somewhere inside the cabin. She can see a flashlight through the door and knows that Mrs. Voorhees is in there looking for her. She holds the pantry door shut, terrified, and just when the danger seems to have passed, Mrs. Voorhees breaks down the door and attacks Alice with a machete. Alice grabs a frying pan, blocking her slashes and slamming her in the head, knocking her out for the third time. She crumbles to the floor, and Alice notices blood coming from the back of her head, thinking she must have killed her. Alice runs down to the lake, and just as she is catching her breath, she notices Mrs. Voorhees sneaking up behind her in the reflection of the water. She knocks the machete out of her hand with the paddle, and the two of them fall to the ground, battling to the death. Mrs. Voorhees chokes her out, bites her arm, and bashes Alice's head into the dirt over and over. Alice manages to escape and grabs the machete. Mrs. Voorhees stands there horrified, but it's too late for apologies, and Alice slices her head clean off of her shoulders. Her headless corpse falls to the ground, and Alice breathes a sigh of relief. She decides to get in the canoe and paddles out to the center of the lake where she falls asleep. Okay, that was an epic showdown. Alice fought it out like a true cage match champion, and honestly, I'm very impressed. There's just one more thing I want to add. Even though it was well deserved, I wouldn't have chopped Mrs. Voorhees' head off like that. Think about it this way. When the cops show up tomorrow and find 7 dead campers and a headless old lady, how are things going to look? Do you think they'll believe that the old lady was the killer? I would have knocked her out and tied her up instead. That way, in the morning, she could answer for her crimes. It would really stink to survive all this just to wind up in prison over false murder charges. The next morning, Alice wakes up floating in the middle of the lake and sees a police car coming to her rescue. She looks super relieved to finally be getting out of there, and that's when zombie boy Jason lunges out from the lake and drags her under screaming. It turns out he really was there all along. That makes 8 campers down and the story is over. Or is it? Alice wakes up screaming in the hospital and doctors rush to her side. They tell her that everything is fine now, and a police officer informs her that all of her friends are dead. She asks if the boy Jason is dead too, but the officer has no idea what she is talking about. Then he's still there, Alice says, and looks off into the distance as she realizes that the nightmare might not be completely over. Spooky. Is that what you would have done? How would you survive Camp Crystal Lake? Let me know with a comment down below. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like and subscribe, and check out the How to Beat playlist for more videos just like this. And don't forget from now on that we'll be uploading on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Until next time, have a damn good day.